Though the Chinese Communists lost 70,000 men during Fifth Phase Offensive in June, they tried again, this time on the eastern side of the peninsula. The 8th Army once again counterattacked and pushed the Chinese back over the 38th parallel. The 1st Marine Division kept going and occupied the Punch Bowl, a volcanic area 25 miles above the parallel. Though the first talks between UN commanders and communist leaders failed, the Korean War now stalled along the 38th parallel, and possession of territory became politically important. When the CCF attempted to force the 1st Marine Division out of the Punch Bowl, the Leathernecks experienced the most vicious fighting of the war. In early September, the division was directed to take the remainder of the Punch Bowl. Hampered by rains, poor roads, and a well-entrenched enemy, the Marines nevertheless gained their initial objectives in hard fighting when 10 Corps suspended offensive operations. The winter of 1951 found the 1st Marine Division deployed along 11 miles of front just north of the Punch Bowl. In mid-March, the division was reassigned in Korea to the I Corps area at the far western end of the 8th Army line. The division assumed responsibility for approximately 35 miles of front line, which overlooked Panmunjom and included the defense of the Pyongyang-Seoul corridor. The pace of war now slowed, with small, localized actions replacing the earlier large-scale offensives. In midsummer 1952, in the first major Marine ground action in Western Korea, the 1st Marine Division began its defense of Outpost Bunker Hill. By the time June gave way to July, the ripping crackle of gunfire and the heavier crump of exploding mortar and artillery rounds had become a near daily occurrence. All along the 1st Marine Division's front, a constant snarl of nasty little engagements kept things in a continual state of alert. Usually, they were inconclusive affairs, flaring to a raging intensity, and then sputtering out, only to burst into flame anew in another sector. Nevertheless, a man could be killed quite dead in one of them.
Well, it's a funny feeling. The person that says they're not scared, they're lying. You know that because I joined Fox Company, 1st Marine Division, and when I joined them, there was only 6 men left. And I asked, where is the rest of them? Well, last night they all got wiped out, and there was only 6. I made the 7th man. And I asked what happened. They said, well, at daytime, the gooks don't fight. It's at nighttime when they come out.
Outpost Yoke had been the site of fierce fighting scarcely more than a week before. Intermittently occupied by the Marines during the day, Yoke was usually outposted by the Chinese at night.
We'd go from one outpost, and then the gooks would move in, and then we'd go back and take another one, and they move in, and this went on. It was just like a circus. Because Bunker Hill, we took it 3 times. Every time we took it, we were winning the war too fast. We were told to walk off and let the gooks get back on.
On July 2nd, the mission of the Marines was a raid by 2 reinforced platoons for the purpose of taking prisoners. Shortly before 0630, the advanced platoon was taken under heavy fire by the Chinese defenders at Yoke. The platoon was raked by rifle, automatic weapons, and machine gun fire, and pummeled by a rain of mortar and artillery shells. The Chinese were on Yoke in strength, fully a battalion of them on the low hill.
But you didn't walk up the hill, you crawled up the hill. Because if you walked up, you wouldn't have stood a chance. Like platoon leaders, their life expectancy is about 18 minutes in combat. I had 6 of them. And you just crawl up the hill, and none of us wanted to play John Wayne, let's be honest with you. We wanted to get in and get out. If we didn't have to, it was like an old dog. You had to pinch us to get us to move.
Casualties among the Marines were immediate and severe. Nonetheless, the attack fought its way forward, due in no small part to the outstanding leadership of non-commissioned officers who stepped forward to fill the void when officers fell. When the leader of one of the rifle squads fell wounded, William Shuck, although wounded himself, took command of the squad. Forming an assault force with it and his own machine guns, Shuck launched 2 coordinated attacks against the entrenched Chinese, suffering a second wound in the process. Shuck refused medical attention, breaking off the attack and pulling back only when ordered to do so. While seeing to the evacuation of the last of the wounded, Shuck was instantly killed by a single round of small arms fire. For his courageous and selfless action and indomitable leadership, William Shuck posthumously would be awarded the Medal of Honor. Courage was common among the Marines of the Western Front. In early August, a major Chinese outpost, Bunker Hill, was in the zone of action of 2nd of the 1st. A detached squad from Easy Company held a much smaller outpost, Siberia, slightly northeast of Bunker Hill. Siberia provided the match that ignited the powder keg of Bunker Hill, an affair that would eventually chew up some 700 Marines and more than 3,200 Chinese. Siberia, officially Hill 58A, was a thorn in the side of the Chinese. As long as the Marines held Siberia, the Chinese across the way could not bring accurate observed fire on the Marine defense. As the Chinese saw it, the Marines on Siberia had to be evicted. Just before 0100 on August 9th, they set about doing just that. From a pair of heights to the north, Hill 110 and Hill 120, several platoons of Chinese threw themselves at the lone squad of Marines on Siberia. There were too few Marines and too many Chinese. Taken under heavy fire from 3 sides, the defenders of Siberia fought like demons, but after holding on against overwhelming odds for 30 minutes, they were left with no choice but to withdraw. The Marines lashed back immediately. At 0300, supported by artillery fire, a reinforced platoon from Easy Company launched a determined attack to drive the Chinese from Siberia. Met by artillery, rifle, and machine gun fire, the platoon, after 3 attempts, was forced to withdraw. A second Marine assault met with greater success. First, Marine F-9F and Air Force F-80 jets plastered Siberia with 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs and canisters of flaming napalm. Hot on the heels of this, a reinforced platoon from Able 1st and the 1st, the regiment's reserve battalion, followed a thunderous barrage by the 11th Marines to the crest of Siberia despite ferocious resistance by the Chinese. The Marines held the crest and south slope of Siberia. The Chinese clung doggedly to the northern slope. Neither Marines nor Chinese were willing to give an inch. More than 5,000 rounds of Chinese mortar and artillery fire pummeled the shell-blasted hillside, causing casualties to soar among the Marines. Chinese fell in windrows before Marine fire. Finally, with casualties reaching the 75% mark, the Marines were forced once again to relinquish their hold on Siberia. But the battle wasn't over yet. At 0105 on August 10th, under the cover of darkness, Charlie Company, 1st of the 1st, charged up the slope of Siberia.
Our mission was to attack this mountain stronghold, and it was covered with Chinese. They were all dug in with dozens of machine gun emplacements, mortar everywhere. They had artillery dug in for point-blank fire against you.
Surprised, the Chinese reacted violently with a hail of automatic weapons fire and grenades.
The platoon in front of me, the assault platoon, I was right behind the assault platoon with the company commander, and they got up to kind of a military crest of this mountain. We had fought our way through the Chinese trenches till we got to this one point, and the Chinese pinned his platoon down and overrun it and killed them all but one man. So we're taking casualties very quickly. And some of us are struggling up the hill, and the others are already wiped out. So the company commander and I became, with the next platoon, became the assault platoon.
The struggle quickly became hand-to-hand.
So I let out a wild war whoop there and jumped astraddle of the trench, and there was 8 Chinese crouched down, and 7 of them in front of me and 1 behind me. And they were so close, I stuck my carbine in one of them's ear and shot him, and right against his ear too. And the one behind me slammed a burp gun in my back, and he was pulling the trigger. I seen him as I tried to turn, he was pulling the trigger. And I just kept screaming in his face, as I turned around, and I think he froze, because I got the first shot off, and I got him in the neck, and he dropped his burp gun and dove forward and grabbed me by the legs, and I hit him with my carbine and knocked him off of me and shot him in the heart. And as I turned around, the whole bunch of them were trying to shoot me, but I got my carbine going on automatic, and I just raked them. And in seconds, I had 6 dead and 1 wounded.
Some Chinese fought to the death. Most, however, were forced off the hill by the sheer momentum of the Marine attack. Still, there was no peace on Siberia. Shortly after daybreak, the hill was assaulted by a reinforced Chinese company, supported by massive mortar and artillery fires. For the 3rd time, the Marines were forced to withdraw from Siberia and return to the main line. Either side, if willing to pay the price, could take Siberia. Neither side could hold it. There had to be a better way. For the 1st Marines, that better way was Bunker Hill. Located slightly southwest of Siberia, Bunker Hill dominated Siberia and overlooked Hills 110 and 120. In addition, it was much more defensible than Siberia and offered promising possibilities for a surprise attack. That attack began as night fell on August 11th, when 4 M4 tanks and 4 M46 tanks from Company C, 1st Tank Battalion, with infantry support, staged a diversionary attack on Siberia. At 21:10, the 4 M46s opened up on Siberia with high-velocity 90mm fire, covering the advance of one section of flamethrower tanks that burned their way up the slope of Siberia. Close behind the flame tanks came the 3rd Platoon of Dog Company. The Marines swept over Siberia in a rush, then, in accordance with the plan, withdrew. Their part in the operation successfully concluded. Meanwhile, the main attack force, Baker Company, reinforced by tanks and combat engineers, closed on Bunker Hill. In one mad rush, the Marines swarmed up its sides. 10 minutes later, one platoon had reached the crest, and another was at the hill's base, sweeping forward along the west slope. At first, taken by surprise, the Chinese seemed confused. Eventually, Communist resistance increased and solidified. Communist small arms fire raised in intensity, while Chinese defenders rained a shower of grenades on the attacking Marines.
There was fierce, close combat during that time, where we had the M46 tank with a 90mm gun. And on one occasion, we were overrun by Chinese, where we'd turned the turrets on each other and fired 30 caliber machine guns to keep them off the tanks. It was quite an adventure as I think back to it.
For a few hectic minutes, there was a vicious, point-blank firefight all along the crest of Bunker Hill. Then, the momentum and intensity of the Marine attack swept the Chinese from the hill and sent them tumbling down the west slope. The Chinese fought back briefly with a barrage of mortar fire, but by 02:30, Bunker Hill was solidly in friendly hands.
Killing the bastards. Just firing, shooting. Kill the son of a bitches. They're pounding on the turrets. with the butts of their rifles. What's going through your mind? You're not thinking about movie stars or eating ice cream. You're trying to stay alive. You got to keep cool. You got to keep your mind about you. You have to continue the fight. You're on a mission. That's what you're there for. It's happening. Keep firing. And pretty soon it's over. And everything gets quiet. And then you get scared. And then you get scared. And you shake. And you don't talk about it. You talk about it years later. Not then. Because it becomes normal. That's what you're there for. You're scared to death. You don't know when it's going to happen again. You're on the edge. But there's Marines all around you. What can happen to you?
The surprise night attack on Bunker Hill had been a complete success. The former Chinese outpost was firmly in Marine hands. Now all that remained was to hold on to it. As events would prove, that would take a bit of doing. In late April, truce talks resumed at Panmunjom, which again did not prevent a renewed outbreak of savage fighting in Western Korea. While truce details were worked out by negotiators, Communist forces launched a regimental strength attack against the I Corps sector. Heavy fighting took place in the Nevada cities and Hook area outposts. During the first week of July, the command outposts Berlin and East Berlin in the 7th Marines Right Regimental Sector came under attack during the Marines' relief of the U.S. 25th Infantry Division. In true Marine Corps fashion, the outnumbered Leathernecks did not concede any ground. In early spring, the 1st Marine Division moved from Eastern Korea to the Western Sector. Its new assignment was to defend 35 miles of the Jamestown Line, a section of the 8th Army's main line of resistance. As part of Operation Mixmaster, the Leathernecks now watched over a difficult area dotted with ridges and small streams, stretching all the way to the Semichon River. In front of their positions, poised and ready to do battle, were the Chinese 63rd and 65th Armies. Both units were eager to put Mao's new strategy to the test: kill as many Marines as possible. The Korean War version of King of the Hill was about to begin on these outposts. As hand-to-hand fighting ensued, Captain Bernard W. Peterson, a forward air controller, wrote home to his wife, "I went to church this morning and sat there and prayed with all the rest to bring a ceasefire end to this bloody mess." In 1952, the U.S. elected a new president, and on November 29, 1952, the president-elect, Dwight D. Eisenhower, went to Korea to learn what might end the Korean War. One of Eisenhower's campaign promises had been to break through the deadlocked negotiations at Panmunjom. But his 3-day visit did nothing to speed up the peace talks. Instead, Eisenhower discovered, as Truman already knew, that the peace talks were tightly bound up in the ideological rhetoric of the Cold War. It would require an extraordinary event to break the deadlock. Peace talks usually take place after an enemy has been defeated and the killing has ceased. In the Korean conflict, however, neither of these conditions existed. The two sides had fought to a stalemate along the former border between North Korea and South Korea, the 38th parallel. By the summer of 1951, it was clear that unless each side wanted to escalate the scale of the conflict, the Cold War would not be decided in Korea. So both sides faced the difficult task of restoring peace. The UN leadership and the Soviet Union agreed that the time had come to talk about peace terms. As the major supplier of financial, military, and political assistance to Communist China and to North Korea, the Soviets played a major role in bringing the Communists to the conference table. Those talks began on July 10, 1951, at a small town called Kaesong, just north of the 38th parallel and behind the lines of enemy. On several occasions, UN negotiators on their way to the talks were harassed by North Korean soldiers. As a result, the conference site was moved to a safer spot, a town called Panmunjom, just west of Kaesong, but outside the reach of Communist forces. The UN negotiating team was headed by Admiral Turner Joy, General Ridgway's naval chief. He and his staff confronted 2 Chinese generals and 3 North Korean generals. The peace talks were among the most prolonged and bizarre events in diplomatic history. The talks were carried out while the most vicious and destructive phases of the conflict occurred. From July until November 1951, during the battles on the ridgelines, there were nearly 60,000 UN casualties, of whom more than 22,000 were American, and almost 234,000 North Korean and Chinese casualties. The talks dragged on for nearly 25 months. Admiral Joy described them as proceeding with all the speed of a stiff concrete mix. The talks were stalled by disagreements over the shape of the negotiating table, by the intrusion of armed soldiers, and by the occasional walkout of angry negotiators. All of the items on the agenda created major disputes. One issue was the location of the final line dividing North and South Korea. UN troops had moved north of the 38th parallel along a line of ridges in order to hold strong positions on high ground. Admiral Joy wanted to keep that advanced line as the new boundary. The Communists found this line unacceptable. So the 2 armies continued to battle for the land between the ridges and the 38th parallel for another 2 years. Finally, the peace talks bogged down over the emotionally charged issue of what to do with prisoners of war. The United Nations wanted all prisoners to be free to choose where they wanted to live. The Communists feared freedom of choice would result in the refusal of Communist prisoners to return to their countries. In April 1953, the United Nations and Communist negotiators were able to come to the first agreement over POWs, called Operation Little Switch. Under the agreement, sick and wounded POWs would be exchanged. Many of the other outstanding POW issues were resolved within the next 3 months. At last, the Korean War was over. An armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Korea remained divided at the 38th parallel, roughly where the conflict started 3 long years before. North Korea ended up being about 21,000 square miles smaller than it had been in June 1950. The political differences between the 2 halves of Korea continued to poison relations between them. In spite of its limited nature, the Korean War was tremendously destructive. Korea's industrial base was wiped out. 4 million Koreans were casualties. The Korean War is often considered a draw or even a defeat for the UN. However, this reasoning assumes the lack of a total battlefield victory was a defeat. In fact, the Korean War was an unmistakable victory for the United Nations. Most of the important UN demands were met in negotiations. The Communists suffered far greater manpower and economic losses than the UN. And finally, the West halted the first major Communist attempt at overt aggression. If South Korea had not been defended, China and the Soviet Union, it's reasonable to assume, would have continued a more overt policy against the West. On March 25, 1953, South Korean President Syngman Rhee awarded the entire 1st Marine Division the Korean Presidential Citation. During the Korean War, units of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing flew more than 125,000 sorties in support of United Nations forces. Almost 40,000 of these sorties were close air support missions. Marine helicopter squadrons evacuated more than 10,000 wounded personnel and greatly increased the survival rate for wounded Marines. The price of liberty and human costs is always high, and the Korean War was no exception. Marine casualties totaled over 30,000. Just over 4,500 Marines gave their lives in Korea. 42 Marines were awarded the Medal of Honor for heroism above and beyond the call of duty in Korea. 27 of these awards were posthumous. Both General MacArthur and General Ridgway knew that the tip of the spear in Korea was the 1st Marine Division. The Marines were the best trained and most tenacious fighters in the world. They would not fall back, not give an inch unless ordered, and then only grudgingly. Though sometimes viewed as an indecisive conflict, the Marine Corps proved once again they would always be faithful to their duty and their country.